industry and you work as a concept artist for video games, speed is probably the most important part apart from you being a great designer. Being a great designer is obviously always coming in the first place, but also making sure that you can create assets and you can create concept art with a timely manner is going to be extremely important. And what is the easiest way to make sure that you can create concept art that will be done fast and it will look great? Obviously, photography. The reason to use photography is not to cheat, as you might think, because again, you're not painting, you're just using something that is already in existence. It's there to make things much easier for you to get the ideas out as soon as possible and sell them in terms of how they look as soon as possible and as quickly as possible, while keeping the quality of the results. The photo itself has to be considered as a tool. Using photography for your concepts is not cheating. It's actually adding extra value. You could say using Photoshop is cheating because you're not using gouache or oils or turpentine or any kind of traditional medium. But nobody works in traditional medium in concept art in video games anymore because it's just an obsolete tool. It takes too long to create a painting. It takes too much effort to change anything in painting. And remember that working for video games and even in film is a collaborative effort. It's not your own personal project, which by all means, if you want to paint everything from scratch, that's the way to go. It is a collaborative process, which means you want to deliver the best possible quality that everyone can use later on. When you use photography in your paintings, it means you're already getting the fidelity of details that you don't have to spend time painting. It just doesn't make any sense. The photo itself will contain all the details that you need to have. When you're learning how to paint, the best way to learn is use photography as a reference or go outside and do plein air. That's probably the best way to learn. And the way to learn is to observe light direction and color, and how color behaves when hitting the objects and how those objects are going to look in different lighting scenarios. The best way is to observe. You need to spend a lot of time looking at what's outside, examining how clouds are behaving, how the sun position is changing the way everything looks. And those things just require a lot of practice in terms of how to understand light and color. When it comes to concept art, we want to use light and color to create realistic paintings, color paintings. And in this chapter, I want to discuss how to use photography and also how to examine photography for lighting and color and also potential texture use. So let's get going. Okay, so we'll start with a photography to examine lighting first and figure out where the lighting is coming from based on what we see and how we need to collect images later on in order to create very similar lighting scenarios. I have those two photos here that I made in Yosemite, and basically those are two different lighting scenarios, but I'll talk about similarities and differences of those two photographies. So first thing first, we can clearly see that the light direction is coming from somewhere right here. So let's use maybe a regular brush. So we have our light that is probably somewhere outside right here, okay? And the direction of this light is coming towards a camera, a little bit shifted to the left. Very similar situation right here, although the light is way above, somewhere outside the canvas right here. However, the direction of the light or the directionality in which it's coming to the scene is very similar. So those are two similarities of these two images. Now let's talk about differences. The biggest difference obviously is the fact that this image here on the right or on the left is basically different time of day, which means the sun is a little lower. The shadows are becoming more blue because the sun intensity is lower, which means the light that is coming from the ambient color of the sky is becoming more prominent and more visible. When you look at this kind of scenario, which is midday, the sunlight is very high above, and you can see it's outlining or casting shadows from those trees right here on the rocks. And you can see that the shadows are very short. They're not too long. And also there's much more contrast in terms of light versus shadow. The light itself is very bright, much like in the first photo on the left side, but the shadow is much darker. It's less blue in coloration. It's actually more contrasty and more darker. Obviously, you have to take into consideration the fact that those are photographies. So they can only mimic what I've seen when I was there, but they're not going to be perfect in terms of what exactly is in those places. The light will behave slightly different. The camera aperture, the camera lens will only try to capture the best of the light and situation as it can, but because of how lenses work, the contrast might be off, and the saturation or the color of the scenery might be off as well. So it's not going to be 100% perfect. Those two photos are unedited. I haven't done any editing to those photos, and I actually hate editing any photos that I take, because they are becoming useless for what I paint. If you heavily edit photos, what happens is you're creating an imagination of color and light that doesn't exist. Adding specific saturation or doing extra saturation, changing the contrast, all those things will affect how the photo looks, and it might actually make the photo more interesting. But for purpose of using photography for textures, you have to be really aware of that. You want to avoid any photos that are heavily processed. You want to get as raw photography as possible to avoid any of the processing done by other artists. So you can do the processing by yourself, and you can only do it only within the image that you're working with. All right, so how else do we examine the color and light? So obviously, depending on the time of day, we have our sun that is really up there. We also have shadows that are, very blue. And what else can be found in this photo in terms of lighting direction? Well, first of all, it allows us to see that the shadows are a little longer. And imagine a situation where you want to paint an environment where you have longer shadows, the sun is a little down, and it's somewhat in front of the camera. This would be a perfect scenario for that. But in order to use this photo and maybe use other photography in your painting, you want to set yourself a bunch of rules. So first rule is always have same light direction on all the photos you choose to work with in that specific image. The second rule, make sure that the sun height is more or less the same. It's fine to use, let's say, late afternoon and early afternoon photos, because but with the same light direction. Because you can still fix the shadows. You can make the shadows darker or brighter slightly. The difference is not going to be too heavy. But once you get to, let's say, the golden hour versus noon, that's two kinds of photos that you should try to avoid combining together, because first of all, the length of the shadows is going to be completely different, and also temperature of the light will be completely different. So those are two most important aspects that you need to take care and take into consideration when you're working with photography. All right, so now let's examine those two photos that we've looked at, and how we can use them and how we can find the use of them in our painting. So we have our sketch that we've done in the previous lesson, and what I try to do always when I have a sketch and the sketch itself is already suggesting me what's the light direction and what's the time of day, more or less, and once I have those informations and I follow the rules that I've set up for myself, light direction and time of day, and color palette obviously matters, because you don't want to have a sunny day in the summer and then use photography from the winter. That's pretty obvious. So once I have those rules set, what I want to do is examine the photos that I have at hand, or when I search for photos, imagine what can I do with those photos and how can I use them in my image. So I'm looking at this. This is a glacier point in Yosemite Park. Obviously, Yosemite here is going to be a very good example for how we can use our photos in this drawing. And obviously, because this drawing is black and white, the easiest way to use those photos and to explain how I would examine the texture information would be to have this texture information in black and white so we're not confused by changes of hues. All right, so let's do that. Let's change the hue to black and white here right now. So we're only focusing on the hues themselves. Let's go right here to this photo as well and do it the same way, and change it to black and white. And now we can see that we have two different photos, and we can start applying those things or the information from those photos to our image. So first of all, when I'm looking at rocks and when I'm thinking about rocks, I'm looking at 2 or 3 aspects. First of all, the texture. How can I use the texture? Where is it going to fit? What's the angle in which the texture is reflecting the sun, or how far and how close the texture is to me. When I'm looking at this photo, this texture is pretty close. It's having quite a heavy Fresnel. It's actually reflecting quite a lot of sun, and what it's telling me is that I cannot use this texture anywhere in the near proximity of the camera, because my camera position is pretty high in this sketch. And anything that will be close and have high reflectivity like this will just look wrong. So what I want to do is, let's say I really want to use this texture. I really like it, and more or less, you know, I can see it fit to my environment. So let's make a selection like this. Control C and Control V. All right, I'll scale it down. Control T to enable the bounding box. Shift so I can scale uniformly, and then rotate. When you can see the arrow changes to rotation, and I can rotate it around like this. And you can see that I start to see how this could be used and where the shadows are. Maybe I want to flip it, so I'll right click and say flip horizontally. And I can see, okay, maybe this is not going to work that well in terms of this flip, so I'll flip it back and put it this way. And scale it down a little more, and maybe press enter, and I'll do again Control T, and maybe scale it like this and do a little rotation. So what I'm doing here is I'm examining where this could fit, and I'm seeing that it could probably fit right here. And obviously this is not working perfectly, so what I want to do is I want to take this part right here, make that selection, Control Shift and J. So in our layers, we're actually creating a new layer out of selection, cutting it out from the previous layer, and maybe move it right here. So now I have a little bit of texture information. I'll merge those two together, create a mask, and then paint on the mask to erase outside of, you know, of the boundaries of those mountains that we have here. And what I want to do is also, you know, click back and forth and see if this texture is really fitting in the correct way. And I can see that it could require a little bit of that transformation. So I'll make a selection like this, Control T, and then just make sure I have layer selected, not the adjustment layer. Control T again, and do little adjustments like this. Maybe scale it up, maybe move it right here, and there we go. And do a little bit of erasing on the mask itself. And what I'm allowing myself to do here is I'm bringing a little bit of that texture information to our drawing. And you can see that this is just the first step. This is far from being done, but it's already allowing us to create a little bit of that information for how the texture is looking. And I might actually make a selection here and Control T and move it around a little bit like this. There we go. And again, go to my mask and then paint it out there. Maybe make the size of the brush a little bigger, so it's almost like fading out. And what's happening is we're having a nice texture information now. So when we zoom in, you can see there is a nice frequency of the texture. And this took us only a couple of minutes, but what it allowed us to do is to create the photorealism of those sections. Now, all you need to do is to create much more of that photorealism is to find more photography that looks kind of like this. So what I like about this photo next is the parts that are on the shadowy area right here. They could be useful for other areas of the image. So I'll make Control C and press Control V to paste it in. And I can see that because this is in shadows, there's not really that much of a Fresnel that is affecting it. I can scale it down to maybe this kind of size. And what I can do is I can use it in a couple of places. And the way I'm thinking about it is, let's look at the shadowy area. We have a big chunk of shadow right here and a big chunk of shadow right here. So what I can do is I'll duplicate this layer that I have here. So we have two of those, as you can see. Move one here and then keep one right here. Maybe just change of the rotation a little bit. Maybe just scale it a little bit so it's slightly different. And merge those together. Now I will create a mask out of it. Control I to invert the mask to hide it. And what I can do here is I can go to this layer right here, go to my either a quick selection tool or magic wand. I'll actually use magic wand and make a selection like this here. Shift and press again. So I have those two dark areas selected. And now Control H will actually hide the selection. The selection is still here, but it's hidden from the view. So that way, when we paint, we're not distracted by those little snaky looking outlines. So I'll now go back to that adjustment layer, select the brush, maybe make the brush to be this one or this one. So it's like a custom brush. And I'm gonna use white color to paint on that mask right here. And what you can see is all of a sudden we start to see, maybe I'll use a different brush so it goes slightly faster. You can see what starts to happen is in those selection areas we start to see that texture popping in. And obviously this is too bright. So what we need to do is go to that layer and we can either change the saturation or the value of that layer by creating a new levels. And I would suggest doing that. But also make sure that you have your selection disabled because it's going to affect the way this values the mask of this new levels. So let's delete that and press OK. Press Control M, or so actually press M and then click anywhere outside to clear the selection. I'm actually going to delete those levels layer, adjustment layer, and create a new one. And then clip it by pressing Alt and in between the layers. And now what I'm going to do is I'll start adjusting to make it more or less the same value as it was in the original layer. So maybe something like this. Now I can see that the frequency is probably too large for how far this is. So what I need to do is I'll make a selection of more or less where I can see this layer is or this part of the texture is. Control T, and then I can start scaling it like this. And I'm looking at the changes of the value and I can see, okay, maybe I want to do something like that, where some of that values are changing and whatnot. Okay, this kind of looks better, and I can actually maybe erase a little bit of that bottom. So we're getting a little bit of that texture information, but not too much, and it works pretty well. And I'll do the same thing for the other part. There we go. So I want to have that highlight that we got from the texture. Actually, I think it looks pretty cool because it's adding that extra edge to this rib looking sharp rocks that we have here. And this is how I would work with those textures. You can see that with just a couple of minutes and few textures from the photo, we're getting much more fidelity in our image. Even though it's scattered right now, it's not really everywhere, and you can obviously populate it all across. We're getting pretty good information here. And the similar situation we could do for the background. So let's select this part here, Control C, go to the background layer, Control V, and then maybe we want to have this kind of rocks in the background like that. A mountain range in the background. And I'll create a mask again, Control I, and then start painting on the mask. Actually, I'm erasing on the mask right here, so. And I can see that it's a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark, the mask itself, so, or the layer that we pasted. So I'll just make another adjustment layer for levels, and then just, you know, adjust it accordingly and only make it affect that new texture. So you can see we're adding more depth and fidelity, and I don't have to spend a lot of time to paint what could possibly be there in the background. I can just, you know, use the photo texture, and this is gonna work pretty well. And I would personally work in this technique quite a lot, and you will see me doing that quite a lot because this is a very efficient way of working. You can create quite a lot of details with minimal amount of effort and get really nice fidelity in your environment images. Trees. It's going to be a brush stroke, and whatever is white is going to be transparent. So here, those eyes and the smile itself, those are the elements that will create a brush, and everything else that is in the background will actually So here, those eyes and the smile itself, eye transparency. So this is pretty much how you create brushes. So this is pretty much how 9%, we can move it up, and you can see to say something like this. 79%, we can move it up, and you can see we are creating different layers of distance with those trees. 70. I'll make sure let's see 9%, so there's changes in terms of